The pale yellow sock was still damp with morning dew when they found Denise Sharon Kulb's body on the 12th of November, 1991, in the wooded cul-de-sac of Birmingham Township, Delaware County. Philadelphia had seen its share of violence, but this case would haunt investigators for nearly 3 decades. 27-year-old Denise had vanished just 3 weeks earlier after attending a family funeral and having a heated argument with her boyfriend Theodore Donahue outside her sister's workplace. The last time anyone saw her alive, she was walking into the Philadelphia night with the same man who would later give police 3 different stories about her disappearance. When detectives searched Donahue's apartment 3 days after finding Denise's remains, they discovered something chilling among his belongings, the matching sock to the one found with her body. But in 1991, forensic science couldn't prove the connection beyond doubt. The case went cold. Donahue walked free. For 28 years, a family grieved. For 28 years, a killer lived in plain sight. Until a photography professor at Temple University enhanced some old crime scene negatives and finally gave investigators the evidence they needed. What happened in those final hours of Denise's life? And how did a single sock become the key to solving one of Philadelphia's most haunting cold cases? Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. October 1991 brought the kind of crisp autumn air that made Philadelphia feel alive with possibility. For Denise Sharon Kulb, 27, and determined to start fresh, the changing season matched her changing life. She had finally summoned the courage to move out of Theodore Donahue's apartment in Wissahickon, a decision that had taken months of quiet planning and internal debate. The small apartment she now shared with family felt cramped but safe. Denise arranged her belongings carefully, a few books, some photographs, the simple clothes that comprised her wardrobe. She wasn't wealthy, but she was independent again, and that felt like everything. Her sister found her one afternoon sitting at the kitchen table, writing in a small notebook. "Making plans?" she asked, settling into the chair across from Denise. "Just thinking about what comes next," Denise replied, her pen hovering over the page. "Maybe I'll take some classes. Maybe find a better job." She looked up with a smile that carried both hope and uncertainty. "I feel like I can breathe again." The family photo from that week would later become the image on missing person flyers. Denise's genuine smile captured in a moment of rare optimism. But in that kitchen, surrounded by the familiar sounds of family life, the future seemed full of promise. She tucked the notebook into her purse, unaware that she was planning a future she would never see. The funeral program for the 19th of October, 1991, would become another artifact in a case file that wouldn't close for nearly 3 decades. The memorial service was for a distant relative, the kind of obligation that brings families together in uncomfortable formal clothes and shared grief. Denise wore her best black dress, the one she saved for special occasions. She sat with her sister and mother, offering quiet comfort during the service. The deceased had lived a long life, and the service felt more like a celebration than a tragedy. Denise even shared a few laughs with cousins she rarely saw, trading memories of childhood gatherings and family stories. "She looks happy," one relative whispered to another, nodding toward Denise. "Better than she has in months." It was true. Away from Donahue's controlling presence, Denise seemed to be finding herself again. She participated in the conversations, offered to help with arrangements, and stayed close to her family throughout the afternoon. But Theodore Donahue was notably absent from the gathering, a fact that several family members mentioned to each other in hushed tones. They had grown accustomed to his presence at family events, and his absence felt deliberate and telling. After the service, as families dispersed to their cars, Denise hugged her sister goodbye. "I'll see you later today," she said, making plans to stop by her sister's workplace that afternoon. "We can grab coffee and talk." The funeral program would later be found among Denise's personal belongings, a reminder of her last public appearance before everything changed. In the program's margins, she had doodled small flowers, unconscious marks of a woman still looking toward beauty, still finding reasons to hope. The rotary phone in Denise's room would ring unanswered for days, its persistent tone echoing through empty spaces like a question that couldn't be answered. But that afternoon, as Denise prepared to visit her sister's workplace, the phone was silent, and the future still seemed manageable. She changed out of her funeral clothes into jeans and a sweater, applying a touch of lipstick before heading out. The October air had turned cooler as evening approached, and she pulled her jacket tight as she walked to meet her sister. The visit started normally. Denise arrived at the workplace just as her sister was finishing her shift, and they stood outside talking about the funeral, sharing impressions of relatives they'd seen and memories the service had stirred up. But their conversation was interrupted when Theodore Donahue's car pulled into the parking lot. Several co-workers and family members watched as he got out and approached Denise with determined steps. "We need to talk," he said, his voice carrying an edge that made others instinctively step back. What followed was a heated argument that lasted nearly 20 minutes. Voices rose, hands gestured sharply, and the tension became thick enough that other people in the parking lot began to take notice. Denise's sister moved closer, ready to intervene if necessary, but Denise waved her off. Finally, Denise walked away from Donahue, her jaw set with determination. "I'm done with this," she told her sister quietly. "I'm done with him." But as the evening wore on, something changed. Phone calls were made, voices were lowered, and by nightfall, witnesses would later report seeing Denise and Donahue together again, walking toward his car in what appeared to be a temporary reconciliation. The pale yellow sock would become the most important piece of evidence in a case that spanned 3 decades. But on the 12th of November, 1991, it was simply another tragic detail in a discovery that shattered a community's sense of safety. The group of walkers had chosen the wooded cul-de-sac in Birmingham Township for its peaceful isolation. It was the kind of place where people went to clear their heads, to let their dogs run, to escape the urban intensity of nearby Philadelphia. The trees were thick enough to muffle street noise, and the winding paths felt like stepping into a different world. But when they rounded a bend near a cluster of oak trees, they found something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Partially hidden beneath fallen leaves and forest debris lay the decomposed remains of a young woman. Her clothing was scattered nearby, and among the tragic evidence, investigators would later focus on a single pale yellow sock. The Delaware County Police arrived within minutes of the 911 call, followed quickly by detectives and the coroner's office. They worked methodically, photographing everything, collecting evidence, and trying to piece together what had happened in this quiet place. Identification came within hours. Denise Sharon Kulb had been missing for 3 weeks, and her family had been growing increasingly desperate for answers. The phone call that brought them the news was the one every missing person's family dreads: confirmation that their loved one would never come home. The sock would be photographed from every angle, cataloged as evidence, and stored in the growing file of a case that investigators hoped would be solved quickly. They had no way of knowing that this simple piece of fabric would become the key to justice nearly 30 years later, when technology finally caught up with determination. The matching sock discovered in Theodore Donahue's apartment on the 15th of November, 1991, should have been the smoking gun that solved Denise's case immediately. Detective Ray Morrison knew it the moment he saw it, tucked among Donahue's belongings, pale yellow fabric that matched perfectly with the sock found at the crime scene. "This is it," Morrison told his partner as they photographed the evidence. "This connects him directly to her body." But the legal system in 1991 required more than visual similarities. Without DNA evidence or advanced forensic techniques, the sock represented circumstantial evidence that a skilled defense attorney could potentially dismiss. The pattern matched, the color was identical, but proving beyond reasonable doubt that both socks came from the same pair required technology that didn't exist yet. Donahue sat across from detectives during questioning, his demeanor shifting between nervous cooperation and defensive anger. His stories about Denise's disappearance changed, with each telling first she had left after an apparent robbery. Then he claimed to have seen her near a local bar, finally suggesting she might have run away to start a new life. "Why do your stories keep changing?" Detective Morrison asked. "I'm trying to remember everything clearly," Donahue replied. "It was a confusing time." Among Donahue's possessions, investigators also found Denise's old job application, handwritten in her careful script. The document provided another link between them, but like the sock, it proved their relationship rather than his guilt. The evidence locker received the sock, the job application, and dozens of photographs. Each item was cataloged with hope that additional evidence would emerge to strengthen the case. But as days turned into weeks, no breakthrough came. The matching sock remained tantalizing proof that felt just out of legal reach. The evidence locker box labeled Kulb Denise S. Case number 91 to 1847 would sit unopened for years, containing the fragments of a life cut short and a case that couldn't quite be solved. By early 1992, the initial momentum of the investigation had stalled against the limitations of available forensic science. Detective Morrison spent countless hours reviewing the evidence, looking for angles that might have been missed. The sock was compelling, but defense attorneys would argue coincidence. The inconsistent stories were suspicious, but not necessarily criminal. The job application proved Donahue knew Denise, but everyone already knew they were in a relationship. Interviews with friends and family painted a picture of Donahue as controlling and possessive, but that alone wasn't evidence of murder. Denise's sister described the argument outside her workplace, but she also acknowledged that the couple had reconciled temporarily that same evening. "We know he did it," Morrison told his supervisor during one of their regular case reviews. "We just can't prove it in court." The forensic pathologist's report indicated that Denise had died from blunt force trauma, but the decomposition of her remains made it impossible to determine specific details about the murder weapon or the exact circumstances of her death. Without a confession or a witness to the crime itself, the case began to lose priority as new investigations demanded attention. By the end of 1992, Denise's case file had been moved to the cold case section. The evidence remained carefully preserved, and detectives occasionally revisited the investigation, but active pursuit of charges against Donahue had been suspended. The matching sock sat in its evidence bag, waiting for a day when technology would catch up with suspicion, when photographic enhancement and digital analysis would finally provide the certainty that 1,991 forensics couldn't deliver. The missing person flyers with Denise's smiling face gradually disappeared from telephone poles and storefront windows as weather and time took their toll. What had begun as a community-wide effort to find answers slowly faded into the background noise of daily life. For Denise's family, however, the absence never became normal. Her sister would drive past the wooded area where the body was found, sometimes stopping to leave flowers or simply to sit in the car and remember. Their mother kept Denise's room exactly as she had left it, unable to pack away the belongings of a daughter who had been planning a future. People stopped asking about her. Denise's sister confided to a friend 2 years after the murder, "They move on with their lives, and I understand that. But we can't move on. We're stuck." In October 1991. Theodore Donahue continued living in Philadelphia, finding new relationships and maintaining his freedom while suspicion followed him like a shadow. Neighbors who knew about the case would whisper among themselves, wondering how someone could continue their normal life while under such a cloud of doubt. The community's initial outrage and fear had settled into an uneasy acceptance that some crimes might never be solved. Parents still warned their children about strangers, but the specific terror that had gripped the area immediately after Denise's murder gradually lessened as new concerns took precedence. Local newspapers occasionally ran anniversary stories about unsolved cases, and Denise's photo would appear alongside others, but these remembrances felt more like ritual than active pursuit of justice. The case had become part of Philadelphia's catalog of unsolved mysteries, a file that detectives inherited when they joined the cold case unit, a reminder that sometimes the obvious suspect remains just out of legal reach. The case file folder marked "Unsolved" in red ink would haunt every detective who inherited it over the years. Detective Morrison retired in 1998, passing Denise's case to his successor with a sense of personal failure that he carried long after his badge was turned in. "This one should have been solved," he told Detective Sarah Chen during the case transfer. "We knew who did it. We just couldn't prove it." Chen reviewed the evidence with fresh eyes, hoping to find something her predecessor had missed. The sock evidence was compelling but circumstantial. The inconsistent statements were suspicious but not conclusive. The pattern was clear to anyone who looked at it, but clear wasn't the same as legally provable. Cold case investigations operate on a different timeline than active cases. Detectives would pull Denise's file every few months, sometimes prompted by a news story about advances in forensic science, sometimes simply because the case refused to be forgotten. New techniques in DNA analysis offered hope throughout the 1992nd, but Denise's remains had been too decomposed to yield useful biological evidence. Fingerprint technology advanced, but no prints had been found at the crime scene. Each potential breakthrough seemed to offer promise that ultimately couldn't be applied to this particular case. The frustration was particularly acute because everyone involved in the investigation believed they knew who had killed Denise. The evidence pointed in one direction, but the legal system required certainty that couldn't be achieved with 1992nd technology. Detective Chen would sometimes work on the case during quiet evening shifts, spreading out the photographs and reports on her desk, looking for connections that might have been missed. The folder grew thicker over the years as new reports were added, but the core mystery remained unchanged. The empty chair at family gatherings became a permanent fixture in the Kulb household, a physical reminder of Denise's absence that family members learned to navigate around both literally and emotionally. Christmas 1991 was particularly difficult. Coming just a month after her body was found, her mother set the table for one more person than would be there. Unable to accept that Denise wouldn't walk through the door with her characteristic smile and enthusiasm, the presents that had been purchased before her death remained wrapped under the tree, too painful to return but impossible to open. Years passed, and the grief evolved but never disappeared. Birthdays that would never be celebrated, holidays that felt incomplete, family photos that captured the visible gaps left by violence. Denise's sister married, had children, and tried to build a life while carrying the weight of unanswered questions. Theodore Donahue, meanwhile, continued his life with apparent normalcy. He formed new relationships, held jobs, and participated in social activities, while Denise's family remained frozen in their loss. The contrast was particularly painful for those who believed he had taken Denise's life and then simply moved on. By 2010, nearly 20 years after the murder, some family members had begun to accept that justice might never come. The case was too old, the evidence too limited, and the legal system too demanding of certainty they couldn't provide. But Denise's sister never stopped hoping. She would call the police department periodically to check on the status of the investigation, always receiving polite but discouraging responses. The case remained open, they would tell her, but there were no new developments to report. The empty chair waited through 2 decades of holidays, a silent testimony to a life cut short and a case that refused to close. The digital enhancement equipment in Byron Wolf's Temple University office looked nothing like the police photography labs of 1991. His computer monitors displayed crime scene images with crystal clarity that would have been impossible when the photographs were first taken nearly a quarter century earlier. Detective Maria Santos had brought the case to Professor Wolf in 2015, part of a new initiative to apply modern technology to cold cases. The Philadelphia Police Department had partnered with several local universities, hoping that academic resources could breathe new life into stagnant investigations. These are the original negatives from the Kulb crime scene, Santos explained, handing Wolf a manila envelope that had been carefully preserved in the evidence room. We're particularly interested in the sock evidence. Wolf was a professor of photography and digital imaging, not a forensic specialist, but his expertise in photo enhancement had already helped solve 2 other cold cases. He approached each project with the careful eye of an artist and the systematic methodology of a scientist. The negatives were in remarkably good condition despite their age. Wolf began the enhancement process slowly, using software that could amplify details invisible to the naked eye in 1991. He increased contrast, sharpened focus, and adjusted lighting to reveal patterns and textures that the original photographers had captured but couldn't fully see. When the enhanced image of the pale yellow sock appeared on his monitor, Wolf immediately understood why Detective Santos had brought him this case. The pattern was now clearly visible, a distinctive weave that could be matched definitively to its mate. "This changes everything," Santos said when she saw the enhanced photographs. "This isn't circumstantial anymore. This is proof." The technology that hadn't existed in 1991 had finally caught up with a case that had been waiting patiently for its moment of truth. Heather Booth's signed witness statement would prove to be the final piece of evidence needed to build a case against Theodore Donahue, but getting her to come forward had taken years of patient detective work and careful relationship building. Booth had been Donahue's roommate in the months following Denise's murder, and she had carried disturbing memories of his behavior and statements for nearly 3 decades. She had reported some of these concerns to police in the early 1992, but at the time, investigators couldn't find a way to use her testimony effectively. Detective Santos tracked down Booth in 2018, now a middle-aged woman living in New Jersey with a family of her own. The years had not diminished her memory of Donahue's chilling comments about Denise's death. "He would talk about finding a body in the woods," Booth told Detective Santos during their interview. "He described details about how she was positioned, what she was wearing. He even mentioned her name Denise or Sharon," he would say. What made Booth's testimony so powerful was the specificity of details. Donahue had shared information that had never been released to the public. He described the location where Denise's body was found, the condition of her remains, and even mentioned the scattered clothing that investigators had discovered. "At the time, I thought maybe he was just repeating things he'd heard from someone else," Booth explained. "But as the years went by, I realized he was describing things that only someone who had been there could know." The witness statement, combined with the enhanced sock evidence, created a compelling case that prosecutors felt confident they could take to court. The circumstantial evidence that hadn't been strong enough in 1991 had been reinforced by technology and testimony that hadn't been available during the original investigation. Detective Santos began preparing an arrest warrant, working with prosecutors to ensure that every element of the case was as strong as possible. After 28 years, Denise's family might finally see justice. The arrest warrant for Theodore Donahue was signed on the 2nd of September, 2019, nearly 28 years to the day after Denise's murder, Detective Santos had worked prosecutors for months to ensure that every element of the case was legally solid, learning from the mistakes and limitations that had prevented charges in 1991. The 3rd of September dawned gray and cool in Philadelphia, the kind of weather that suggested autumn was approaching. Donahue, now 52 years old, was living in a modest apartment in the same general area where he had lived during the original investigation. Neighbors later said they had no idea about his connection to an unsolved murder case. The arrest team arrived at dawn, surrounding the building quietly before knocking on Donahue's door. When he answered, still in pajamas and clearly confused by the early hour, Detective Santos read him his rights and informed him that he was being charged with the murder of Denise Sharon Kulb. "This is about something that happened almost 30 years ago," Santos explained as handcuffs were placed on Donahue's wrists. "New evidence has come to light that connects you to Denise's death." Donahue's reaction was a mixture of shock and indignation. He protested his innocence loudly enough that neighbors began to appear at their windows and doorways. Some recognized him as a quiet man who kept to himself, making the arrest all the more surprising to the small community. The charges included murder in the first degree, abuse of a corpse, obstruction of justice, and tampering with evidence. Prosecutors had built their case carefully, incorporating the enhanced SOC evidence, Heather Booth's testimony, and Donahue's history of inconsistent statements to investigators. News of the arrest spread quickly through Philadelphia and beyond. Local television stations covered the story extensively, and Denise's family finally received the phone call they had waited decades to hear. "We never gave up hope," Denise's sister told reporters. "We always believed this day would come." The courtroom proceedings revealed disturbing details about Theodore Donahue's psychology that went far beyond his connection to Denise's murder. Screenshots of his online activity showed that he had used the username Ted Bundy 1967 on various social media platforms, a choice that prosecutors argued revealed his fascination with serial killers and violence against women. The preliminary hearing in October 2019 drew significant media attention, both because of the case's age and because of the technological breakthrough that had finally made prosecution possible. Denise's family attended every session, sitting in the front row and providing a visible reminder of the human cost of the crime. Prosecutor Jennifer Walsh presented the enhanced SOC evidence using large screen displays that showed the comparison between the SOC found with Denise's body and its mate discovered in Donahue's apartment. The digital enhancement made the match undeniable, even to observers without forensic expertise. "Technology has finally caught up with justice," Walsh told the court. "What appeared to be circumstantial evidence in 1991 can now be definitively proven through digital analysis." Heather Booth's testimony proved equally compelling. She described Donahue's detailed knowledge of the crime scene, his casual references to finding Denise or Sharon in the woods, and his apparent lack of emotion when discussing the discovery of her body. The defense argued that the case was too old, that memories had faded, and evidence had deteriorated over time. But the enhanced photographs and preserved testimony created a stronger case in 2019 than investigators had possessed in 1991. Judge Robert Martinez denied Donahue's request for bail, citing the severity of the charges and the defendant's history of providing false information to investigators. "The defendant represents a potential danger to the community," Judge Martinez ruled, "and has already demonstrated a pattern of deception regarding this case." The ruling meant that Donahue would remain in custody while awaiting trial, a decision recent to the Donahue that brought some satisfaction to Denise's family after decades of watching him live freely. The court calendar became a source of both hope and frustration for Denise's family as legal proceedings stretched through 2020 and 2021. What had seemed like imminent justice after Donahue's arrest became another exercise in patience as defense motions, procedural delays, and the COVID-19 pandemic slowed the legal system to a crawl. Defense attorneys filed motion after motion, challenging the admissibility of evidence, questioning the reliability of enhanced photographs, and arguing that the passage of time had compromised the prosecution's case. Each motion required hearings, responses, and judicial decisions that pushed the trial date further into the future. The pandemic brought additional complications, with court closures and social distancing requirements making it difficult to proceed with complex criminal cases. Jury selection became more complicated, witness testimony required special arrangements, and the entire legal process slowed dramatically. For Denise's family, each delay felt like another injustice. Her sister, now in her 60s, worried that some family members might not live to see the case resolved. Their mother, who had carried the grief of Denise's murder for 3 decades, was showing signs of declining health. "We've waited this long," Denise's sister told reporters outside the courthouse after another postponement. "We can wait a little longer if that's what it takes to get justice." But privately, the family struggled with the extended timeline. They had hoped that Donahue's arrest would bring quick closure, but the legal system moved at its own pace, indifferent to their emotional needs. Prosecutors remained confident in their case, but they also understood that time was not necessarily their ally. Witnesses aged, memories continued to fade, and the risk of procedural complications increased with each passing month. By late 2021, there were reports that plea negotiations were underway, though details remained confidential. The possibility of a plea agreement offered the prospect of resolution without the uncertainty of trial, but it also raised questions about whether justice delayed might ultimately become justice compromised. The vigil candle flickered in the evening breeze as family and friends gathered to remember Denise Sharon Kulb on what would have been her 58th birthday in May 2022. The memorial service took place in the same Philadelphia neighborhood where she had lived, loved, and ultimately died 31 years earlier. Reports suggested that Theodore Donahue had entered a plea agreement, though specific details remained sealed by the court. Legal analysts speculated that he might have accepted responsibility for Denise's death in exchange for a sentence that avoided the possibility of life imprisonment, but confirmation would have to wait for official court proceedings. For Denise's family, the prospect of resolution brought mixed emotions. They had waited so long for acknowledgement of their loss that the actual moment felt almost anticlimactic. Justice, they had learned, was more complex than simply punishing the guilty party. Denise was more than a victim, her sister said during the memorial service. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend who brought laughter to our lives. She deserves to be remembered for who she was, not just how she died. The investigation had consumed the careers of multiple detectives, the expertise of a university professor, the memories of witnesses, and the determination of a family that refused to let their loved one be forgotten. It demonstrated both the persistence of truth and the patience required for justice. Professor Byron Wolfe attended the memorial service, bringing with him the enhanced photographs that had finally broken the case open. Science and technology can be tools for justice, he reflected, but they require human dedication to be effective. The pale yellow sock that had waited in an evidence locker for nearly 3 decades had finally told its story. Denise's murder would never be forgotten, but her memory could now be separated from the lingering questions that had overshadowed it for so long. As the candle burned down to its base, family members shared memories of Denise that had nothing to do with her final days. Her love of reading, her quick wit, her kindness to elderly neighbors, her dreams of a better future that violence had stolen away. The case file that had haunted investigators for decades could finally be closed, not with triumph, but with the quiet satisfaction that comes from truth finally revealed. Philadelphia had learned once again that evil can hide in plain sight, but also that persistence and technology working together can bring long-buried secrets into the light. Justice for Denise Sharon Kulb had taken 28 years to arrive, but it had arrived. In a world where many families never receive such closure, her story offered hope that patience and determination can ultimately overcome even the most challenging obstacles to truth. The vigil candle burned out just before midnight, but Denise's memory would burn on in the hearts of those who had never stopped believing that truth would eventually surface. Her story had become more than a cold case. It was a testament to the power of persistence, the advancement of technology, and the unbreakable bonds of family love. In the months that followed, legal proceedings continued their measured pace toward final resolution. While the specifics of any plea agreement remained confidential, court observers noted a sense of closure beginning to settle over all parties involved. The case that had defined careers, consumed families, and challenged the justice system was finally approaching its end. Detective Santos, who had shepherded the case through its final phase, reflected on the investigation's long journey. Sometimes, justice moves slowly, she acknowledged, but that doesn't mean it won't arrive. This case taught me that we can never give up on finding the truth, no matter how much time passes. The wooded cul-de-sac in Delaware County, where Denise's body was discovered, had grown wild over the 3 decades since that November morning in 1991. Trees had grown taller, paths had shifted with weather and seasons, but the location remained a place of significance for those who remembered. Occasionally, family members would visit to leave flowers or simply to stand in quiet remembrance. The community that had been shaken by Denise's murder had evolved as well. New residents had moved in with no knowledge of the tragedy that had occurred in their peaceful neighborhood. But for those who remembered, the resolution of the case provided a sense that their community's safety had been restored, that the questions that had lingered for so long had finally been answered. Theodore Donahue's arrest and prosecution served as a reminder that time doesn't erase guilt, that advances in technology can breathe new life into cold cases, and that the pursuit of justice requires both patience and determination. His fascination with serial killers, revealed through his online activities, added a disturbing dimension to the case that went beyond a single act of violence. The pale yellow sock that had started as circumstantial evidence and evolved into definitive proof became a symbol of how persistence and technology could work together to overcome the limitations that had once seemed insurmountable. Professor Wolf's enhancement work demonstrated that academic expertise could play a crucial role in criminal justice, bridging the gap between scientific knowledge and legal necessity. For future investigators working cold cases, Denise's story offered both inspiration and instruction. It showed that evidence preserved with care could eventually yield its secrets, that witnesses' memories could remain valuable across decades, and that new approaches to old problems could produce breakthrough results. The case also highlighted the emotional toll that unsolved crimes impose on families and communities. Denise's relatives had lived with uncertainty for nearly 3 decades, never knowing if her killer would face justice. Their perseverance in the face of that uncertainty exemplified the strength that families must find when the legal system cannot immediately provide the closure they desperately need. As 2022 drew to a close, the formal legal proceedings approached their conclusion. While specific details of the resolution would be determined by the courts, the essential truth had been established. Denise Sharon Kulb had been murdered, and after 28 years, her killer had been held accountable. The investigation's success story would be studied by law enforcement agencies looking to solve their own cold cases. The combination of preserved evidence, technological advancement, witness cooperation, and investigative persistence provided a model for how seemingly impossible cases could be cracked with the right approach in sufficient time. But beyond its value as a case study, Denise's story remained, at its core, a human tragedy and a family's long journey toward justice. Her life had been cut short by violence, but her memory had been honored by those who refused to let her death go unresolved. In the end, the Philadelphia cold case that had shocked a community with its resolution proved that truth, like justice, may be delayed but need not be denied. The pale yellow sock that had waited patiently in an evidence locker for nearly 3 decades had finally told its complete story, bringing closure to a family and community that had never stopped hoping for answers. Denise Sharon Kulb could finally rest in peace, knowing that her story had been told, her killer had been caught, and her memory would live on in the hearts of those who had loved her and fought for justice in her name. The case was closed, but her legacy, a reminder that every victim deserves justice, no matter how long it takes, would endure.